As world leaders prepare to gather in New York for the 78th meeting of the UN General Assembly, we take a look at China's growing support of the world body. Hello, I'm Arnold Naidoo, and this is The Heat. On June 26, 1945, China became the first country to sign the UN Charter. Nearly 80 years later, as the world deals with major economic and geopolitical challenges, China's support for the United Nations has grown to being, in the words of last year's General Assembly President, a strong buttress to the UN's blue flag. CGTN's Nathan King has more in this report.
The People's Republic of China has been a member of the United Nations and a permanent member of the UN Security Council for over 50 years, and some of its contributions are well known. China is the largest contributor to the United Nations peacekeeping among the 5 permanent members of the Security Council, the second largest contributor to the regular UN budget, and holds an increasing number of leadership positions in United Nations management and the agencies. Over the last few years, China has utilized its increasing diplomatic heft to support the central role of the United Nations in the international system. 2 years ago, President Xi Jinping used his address to the United Nations General Assembly to launch the Global Development Initiative.
The Chinese people have always celebrated and striven to pursue the vision of peace and harmony. China has never and will never invade or bully others or seek hegemony.
The GDI aims to focus global attention on efforts to achieve the UN Sustainable Development Goals for 2030, an ambitious agenda for more equitable global development. More than 100 nations have backed this initiative, with over 60 formally joining a group of friends of the GDI based at the UN. Last year, China also launched the Global Security Initiative at the Boao Forum, a new vision of security for the planet that moves away from confrontation to one of partnership, resolving conflicts through negotiation and consultation, revolving around the concept of indivisible security.
We need to implement the GSI to uphold the vision of common, comprehensive, cooperative, and sustainable security, reject taking sides, block confrontation and a new Cold War, and address differences and disputes through peaceful means to jointly uphold world peace and tranquility.
China has also been working to increase multilateralism, whether through supporting the expansion of the BRICS grouping at the recent South Africa summit and expansion of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, helping magnify the voices of the Global South, often among the most ignored members of the United Nations. China has also increasingly spoken out against so-called minilateralism, such as the Quad grouping of the US, Japan, Australia and India, or the narrow security pact dubbed AUKUS, which will spread nuclear submarine technology among the preferred partners of the US, Australia and the United Kingdom. Hopes are that China, by supporting these new global initiatives and the United Nations system itself, that it can help the world heal from the divisions of the COVID-19 pandemic and those by the conflict over Ukraine. It's only when the world can come together and avoid being divided by the crises of today that it can start to address the common challenges of tomorrow, like climate change, artificial intelligence and sustainable development. Nathan King, CGTN, Washington.
There is much to talk about. Let's get to our panel. Andy Mock is a senior research fellow with the Center for China and Globalization. James P. Moore is the founder and CEO of the Washington Institute for Business, Government and Society. And also with us is Josef Gregory Mahoney. He's a professor of politics and international relations at East China Normal University. Thank you, everyone, for being with us. Andy, China, of course, plays a significant role at the United Nations. It is, of course, a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council, but it also takes part in the specialized agencies of the UN as well. Why is the UN so important for China?
That's a great question, Anand. So to use the concept from international relations, China's foreign policy is guided by something called liberal institutionalism, which just means that it believes that countries can cooperate and peacefully coexist if they work together through multilateral organizations. And this is in stark contrast to some other countries that believe in realism, which essentially just says that the powerful do what they want while the rest suffer what they must. And I think this has been the guiding principle since the very beginning when China joined the UN. And we've seen that it's not just rhetoric, but behavior, financial commitment, and now increasingly the provision of technical expertise as well.
And joining us now as well is Victor Gao. He is chair professor at Soochow University. Victor, great to see you. Victor, we're talking about the United Nations, China's role in the United Nations, as well as the relevance of the United Nations. And as Andy just told us a moment ago, China is one of those countries that believes that cooperation can work, that coexistence is possible. How important is the UN for China?
Thank you very much for having me. Now, we always listen to countries like the United States talk about the rule-based international order. From a Chinese perspective, what is the rule-based international order? It dates back to 1945, when the war was about to end, and when the United Nations was formed. So if we talk about the current international order, its real origin is in the formation and founding of the United Nations. And ever since 1945, and especially ever since 1949, from the Chinese perspective, the world we are living in today should be rallying around the core of the United Nations. That is the supranational organization, which should interface with all the member states, which number about 200, and no one should be allowed on top of all the other countries. And this is an organization with the Security Council of the United Nations at the very core, dealing with the security issues, and then the General Assembly and all the other constituent organizations within the UN family taking care of each of its mandate. This is a better world structure because every country will be treated equally, and there is division of work as to what should be done whenever issues arise. China firmly believes that this should be the structure of the world since 1945, at present, and going forward. China does not tolerate any other country to put itself on top of all the other countries.
Yeah, Victor, membership in the United Nations presupposes that individual countries, even powerful individual countries, must act for the common good. How does China fulfill that kind of mission?
Well, there are many ways to exercise this concept. For example, at the General Assembly, there are the general debate where every country, big or small, will have a chance to talk about what they believe are the major issues facing themselves, but also more importantly, facing the global community. Now, there is also many organizations, for example, the World Health Organization, Food Organization, Environmental Protection Organization, etc., which require very specialized focuses on all these issues. Now, from the member states' perspective, they not only need to do management of their own country's affairs in these respects, but they also need to cooperate with all the other countries whenever there is an issue is arriving, especially, for example, in the case of pandemic. And that is why the WHO will play a very important role, and all countries need to pitch in to do what they are required to do. And I think in this process, there is a lot of common good, and there is many areas where the member states need to do things in concert with each other to perform their international cooperation obligations and duties.
Joseph, great to see you. Of course, China is a major contributor to the UN's finances. It contributes something like 12% of the organization's total budget. It also has played leadership positions in 4 of the 15 principal specialized agencies. It's also had deputies in many of those agencies. What has been the impact of China's engagement, especially when we look over the last 40 to 50 years, when China started its growth to becoming one of the economic superpowers in the world?
In fact, I think most observers would say that over the past 15 to 20 years, we've really seen China's influence in the UN grow considerably. Now, China has played and continues to play many instrumental roles in the UN, but I think there are three that stand above the rest. The first is China's unwavering commitment to multilateralism. We have seen this time and time again, and in fact, China's position here has strengthened while it's increasingly lagged in some other countries who have wavered in their commitment to the UN, to the World Health Organization, to things like the Paris Agreement, and so on. The second is China's major contribution to UN peacekeeping operations. When the PRC took the UN Security Council seat in the 1970s, it had some lingering suspicion about peacekeeping operations, but it has in fact become one of the biggest champion of those operations. It plays the largest role among Security Council members in supporting them in terms of troop contributions, and it's the #2 financial supporter for peacekeeping operations. But at the same time, China also supports reforming how and why peacekeepers are deployed. Beijing is concerned that sometimes they have been deployed to support regime change and other forms of interventionism that run contrary to China's foreign policy principle of non-intervention in other countries' internal affairs. Now, the third major role has been China's efforts to advance global development goals at home and abroad, including the UN 2030 Sustainable Development Goals, which we know took a hit because of the global pandemic. And China has done this with both existing mechanisms in the United Nations, but also starting new ones, like your lead-in mentioned, the Global Development Initiative that has attracted a lot of support and attention from other countries. But likewise, supplementing these efforts with work associated with the Belt and Road Initiative, as well as China's work with other multilateral organizations, including global ones like the World Health Organization, regional ones like ASEAN, AIIB, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and others like BRICS, which supports emerging markets and the global South.
Right.
But again, doing so in ways that support UN goals and visions instead of undermining them with minilateralism or small block military alliances like NATO, AUKUS, the Quad, are superficial international development schemes like B3W and so on.
Right. James, talking about reform, there has been a great deal of debate and discussion, especially in the last few years, over reform, broader reform in the United Nations, especially in the Security Council. There are questions over how the veto is used, the types of membership, and a call for more inclusive membership. Here's the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres talking about that. Let's listen.
Today's multilateral institutions that were created after the Second World War reflect the power and economic dynamics of that time, and so they need reform. And I know reform is fundamentally about power, and there are obviously many competing interests and agendas in our increasingly multipolar world. But at a time when our challenges are more connected than ever, the outcome of a zero-sum game is that everyone gets zero. This is not a time for posturing or positioning. This is not a time for indifference or indecision. This is a time to come together for real practical solutions. It's time for compromise for a better tomorrow.
So, James, China supports additional seats. It wants more representation for the Global South at the United Nations. Do you think we will see the kind of reform that China is calling for at the UN in the near future?
The near future, I don't think so. The United Nations is a very slow-moving body and has slow-moving processes. I was in a unique position and was honored to actually be in the chamber of the General Assembly in 1971 when the People's Republic of China was officially admitted to the United Nations, and that took a very long time. People were questioning how can the most populous nation at that time in the world not have a seat here in the United Nations, and that took place. But again, that was after many years of really trying to deal with this question of the representation. The United Nations, with almost 200 members, is in a position where it is the only body of its kind in the world that brings everybody together to be able to discuss an awful lot of these issues. The Security Council needs to be reformed. The processes by which the United Nations goes out around the world and deals with everything from humanitarian causes to war-strife countries, that needs to be reformed. And it's been, I think, a very positive thing that China has, as was just mentioned, has brought more people to the peacekeeping force than any other country, including the United States, quite frankly. 50,000 peacekeepers or workers for the United Nations have been brought in from China over the years to be able to deal with some very sensitive and difficult issues. But as far as reform of the United Nations is concerned, we need to be able to begin that process now, if not when, and if not who, if not us, who. And so that's something that certainly has got to be taken up in the days to come.
Victor Gao, what is your view on reform at the United Nations? You know, as we heard the Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, say in that short excerpt we heard just a moment ago, he said, look, this is about power. And if we look at the current configuration of the Security Council, it's just a small number of countries that hold on to an enormous amount of power. What's it going to take to change that?
When we talk about the reform of the United Nations, I think the real focus is on the reform of the Security Council of the United Nations, which currently has about 15 member states, including 5 permanent member states, and each of the 5 permanent member states has a veto power. Now, I think it's very complicated. On the one hand, we need to fully recollect that the world order we are living through was formed in 1945. And in 1945, it's because of the heroic efforts of these countries, which helped to defeat Nazi Germany in Europe and imperialist Japan, fascist Japan in Asia. That is the former Soviet Union and China, the United States, Great Britain, and France. Now, this is a fact. No one can argue that these 5 countries, no matter what has happened to them, subsequent years, did a lot of work in defeating Nazism and Japanese fascism in 1945. Now, things keep changing over the decades, and things today in the world are very, very different than in 1945. But we need to keep what happened in 1945 very much in mind. On the other hand, countries like India, for example, they become the largest population in the world. Countries like Brazil and others are really gaining momentum in their development. The global south is becoming more and more popular. So the reform of the Security Council of the United Nations does need to take place. But how to balance all these issues? For example, there are only 5 permanent member states. Should they be increased to 10? And should the new additional permanent member states also have veto power? Allow me to make another point very quick. I think even though the Security Council structure and the process are not perfect, they actually have played a role in making sure that ever since 1945, no world war has ever broken out. Now, you may blame about the Security Council, but the checks and balances within the Security Council actually contributed a lot to the fact that no world war has taken place since 1945. So any reform should be conducted without sacrificing this major balance of power in the world to prevent the outbreak of a world war and to make sure that whatever conflict, security issues taking place in the world can be more effectively taken care of. More representative of the international community, of course, but without giving up any association to the balance of power in 1945.
Andy, we've been talking about China's contributions to global development. Of course, one of its signature initiatives is known as the Belt and Road Initiative, and this year marks the 10th anniversary of that initiative. It's an ambitious infrastructure project which is trying to connect the world by sea and by land. There's 152 countries that are part of it. $1 trillion has been spent on something like 3,000 projects. And China's ambassador to Indonesia, Lu Kang, recently spoke about the Belt and Road Initiative, and this is what he said. Let's listen.
the very purpose of BRI is to enhance the connectivity in order to promote development, common development. So if that was just driven by China's own selfish pursuits or geopolitical ambitions, attempts, as described by some Western governments according to their own experience, you can't explain why in the past 10 years, more and more countries get on board.
So, Andy, of course, we've heard criticism of the Belt and Road Initiative as well, mainly from Western countries. They talk about the debt trap. But listening there to Ambassador Liu Kang, does he have a point?
I think he absolutely does have a point, Anand. So there's a very famous saying that the measure of a society is how it treats its most vulnerable members. And I think this is true on the global stage as well. And we see China with the Belt and Road Initiative, but other initiatives as well, most recently the Global Development Initiative, to really say, look, great countries have a responsibility to helping those facing the greatest challenges achieve development. And this is not through rhetoric, it's through pragmatic actions, of which infrastructure is the most important. And I would say I would also tie this to the prospects of UN reform, because what we're seeing here is clearly there's universal acknowledgement that things do need to be updated. And I'm a little bit more positive and optimistic than some of our guests today about this, in that, first of all, there is increasing support for China's view in the global south. We see this through the Belt and Road Initiative. We see this through the number of countries that want to join BRICS. But we also see this in the UN side as well, because of these initiatives like the Belt and Road Initiative, that the UN, the institution of the UN, wants greater China engagement and wants China to play a greater role in setting not just policy, but organizational priorities as well. So I think given this, I'm a little bit more optimistic that we will see some positive reforms in the UN. And that the Belt and Road Initiative, of course, is playing a very, very positive role. I think about the negative media coverage. This is absolutely true, but we also need to look at what are countries like the U.S. doing. They're essentially copying China's BRI, and we have to see how that plays out. But I think imitation is the sincerest form of flattery.
Joseph, there was a speech made by President Xi Jinping, that was in 2015, and he talked about establishing a United Nations Peace and Development Plan. And part of that plan is China's push to develop what's known as the UN's Spatial Knowledge and Innovation Center, which is something that focuses on things like artificial intelligence. Now, as I said, the president made that speech in 2015, and we've come a long way since then. It's 8 years ago, especially in a field like artificial intelligence. What can you tell us about that?
Well, in fact, in 2020, President Xi Jinping announced that China would be setting up a UN Global Geospatial Knowledge and Innovation Center to help facilitate the implementation of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. And I think what we've seen with the accelerated emergence of AI over the past 2 years, and especially this year, we had the big AI conference here in Shanghai, and I think there were 23 new Chinese AIs that hit the market the day of that conference. This is a global question for global governance. How do we use AI? How do we use it to better support digital governance, but also developing the world? And the question here is very apt because, of course, a lot of people in the West are demonizing Chinese technology. They've instituted the chip war. They've tried to create fear. While what we see with Chinese companies like Huawei, but others as well, particularly as China advances the BRI and other initiatives, when we talk about global connectivity, part of this is about extending high-speed internet, to rural areas so that these areas can have access to digital finance, so they can have access and participate in the latest economic and information resources. So I think this is, and by the way, I was in Shenzhen at a Huawei conference earlier this year, and it was supported. The UN had sent representatives there to praise Huawei for their efforts to support global connectivity. So I think all of these things are part of China's efforts to promote responsible use of technology in international development, particularly in the global south, which has a hard time affording and building this without support from programs like the BRI, and pushing back against this Western and particularly Washington-led effort to demonize not only China, but Chinese technology and China's efforts to work with the global south to advance global development and peace and security.
James, at its core, the Chinese view of multilateralism is based on the idea of win-win cooperation. But I think it's fair to say that there are some members of the United Nations, of course, that they don't share that view. I mean, some members see the UN as an institution which can be used to safeguard their own interests. And given the current kinds of geopolitical tensions we see right now, can the UN be an effective force for stability?
Honestly, to the point we were talking about earlier, until reform takes place, I don't think that can be the case. I mean, when you realize that when the 5 permanent members of the Security Council were indeed chosen, those were the days when there was a USSR, Soviet Union, that had 15 republics, and those 15 republics today are independent nations. The notion that India is on the sidelines and is not a permanent member, Brazil the same way, you have a lot of questions. But I would argue that there are more dilemmas, more challenges today than ever before since the United Nations came into existence. We're dealing with COVID, we're dealing with climate change, we're dealing with artificial intelligence. And if we don't figure out a way to be able to have the world community come together and in a constructive way create the kind of dialogue that leads to solutions to these dilemmas, why do we even have the doors open at the United Nations? And so I think it's important that the seriousness of realizing that reform must take place now.
Okay, and that is where we have to leave it. Thank you to all of you for being with us. That is it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C.
The nature of business is to bring